Hi everyone, this week you'll be learning about angiosperms, which are flowering plants. But before we cover angiosperms, let's quickly review some of the things that were covered in last week's module. And this module was on simple plants and gymnosperms. Recall that there are certain characteristics that are shared by all plants, regardless of whether or not these plants are vascular plants or seed-bearing or seedless plants. Those characteristics include the fact that all plants are eukaryotes, and more specifically, plants are multicellular eukaryotes, which means that they have tissues. Additionally, all plants have cell walls, and they have outer cuticles which serve to prevent water loss. Another characteristic of all plants is that they are autotrophs, and more specifically, they are photoautotrophs. So that simply means that they use the energy of the sun to synthesize organic molecules like glucose. All plants are also characterized by the fact that they have protected embryos. And finally, all plants have alternating life cycles, which means that they have a diploid and a haploid stage, or diploid and haploid parts. Last week's module focused on the bryophytes, which lack vascular tissues and seeds, and those include the mosses and the liverworts. And we also covered the ferns, which have vascular tissues, but they do not have seeds, and the gymnosperms, which have both a vascular tissue and also seeds, but the seeds in gymnosperms are naked seeds. This table shows some of the characteristics of the different types of plants, which include the angiosperms that we're going to be looking at this week, but also the plants we've already covered in last week's module. So before we look at the characteristics of angiosperm, I'm going to quickly review some of the characteristics of the plants we've covered already. So recall that this includes the non-vascular seedless plants, or the bryophytes, which are mosses, liverworts, and hornworts. And in those plants, the gametophyte, which is the haploid stage, is the dominant stage. So that means that when you look at these plants, what you're likely looking at is the gametophyte. The sporophyte is the diploid portion of the plant, and this is a reduced portion that's dependent on the gametophyte for nutrition. But the sporophyte will hold cells that undergo meiosis, and those are the spores, and the spores are going to be released, and they're going to germinate, giving rise to gametophytes. And the gametophytes will either have a female part, which is the archegonium, which has the eggs, or a male part, which is the antheridium, which has the sperm. And recall that in these plants, fertilization has to occur in the presence of water because the sperm are flagellated. These plants don't produce pollen grains, so the sperm cannot be dispersed by the wind. Another reason that these plants need to be present in an environment that is moist is that they lack a vascular system. So that means that they can't grow very tall because there is no vascular system to bring water up to leaves in this plant. So this is the reason why these plants are very short. Ferns, on the other hand, are vascular plants, so they can grow taller. And in these plants, the sporophyte, or the diploid stage, is the dominant stage, whereas the gametophyte is a reduced stage. However, ferns, even though they're vascular plants, they don't have seeds, and they also have flagellated sperm. That means that they have to reproduce in the presence of water for sperm to be able to swim toward the egg. Finally, we have the seed-bearing vascular plants, which include the gymnosperms and the angiosperm. In gymnosperms and angiosperms, the dominant stage is the sporophyte, so the diploid stage is the sporophyte, and the gametophyte is very small, microscopic, so you can't really see it because those are just going to be the cells, the sperm and the eggs, that are present within plant parts. So in the gymnosperms, which we covered last week, you have female cones and pollen cones, which are the male parts of the plants that contain pollen, and the pollen houses the sperm. So the sperm is the gametophyte. And within the female cones, we have the eggs, which are the female gametophytes. And remember that those pollen grains can be dispersed by the wind. So this week we're covering the characteristics of angiosperms, which are flowering plants, and these are the most evolved plants of the plant kingdom. So these are vascular plants that have seeds and also have flowers. The term angiosperm specifically means protected seed or enclosed seed, and that's because the seeds are enclosed within fruit. And when we think of fruit, we typically think of something like an apple, or we think of mangoes, for example. But fruits also include things that we don't typically think of as fruits, like tomatoes and also beans. These are all angiosperms. So fruits have several functions. The primary role of fruits is to protect the seeds from drying out or desiccating. But they're also important for dispersal because they're consumed by animals, and when the animal eats a fruit, eventually the seed, which is undigested, will be excreted by the animal, and that hopefully takes that seed to a new location where the plant can grow, and that reduces competition among the parent and the daughter plants. Angiosperms are divided into two major groups, the monocots and the dicots. And these share some similarities, but there are also some differences between these two groups. Similarities include the fact that they have flowers, as you can see here. They have leaves, stems, and roots, and where the leaves join the stems, that's known as a node. The space between two leaves is known as an internode, as you can see here. One difference that you can already note on this slide is that for the dicots, some of them have a short stem that connects the leaf to the stem, and that's known as a petiole. And that helps to push out the leaf so that it can receive more sunlight, and this improves the efficiency of photosynthesis. The difference after which monocots and dicots are named, it's a difference in the structure of their seeds, specifically in the number of cotyledons. And a cotyledon is simply known as a seed leaf, and this is a structure that's going to provide nutrition for the developing plant before it has real leaves that can carry out photosynthesis. And these are pictured here. So in the monocot, there's a single seed leaf. In dicots, there are two, which are shown not very clearly, but they're shown here in this picture. Another difference between monocots and dicots is the number of petals that they have in their flowers. So monocots have petals that are multiples of 3. So this lily, which is a monocot, has 6 petals, whereas dicots, like this hibiscus flower, have petals that are multiples of 4 or 5. So this flower has 5 petals. Another difference between monocots and dicots is the way in which vascular tissues are arranged in the stems. So in monocots, these vascular bundles, which contain xylem and phloem, are arranged so that they're distributed throughout the stem evenly, and they're parallel to each other. In dicots, on the other hand, you can see that these vascular bundles are arranged in a ring pattern in the stem. There are also differences in the arrangement of these vascular tissues in the roots, which you will examine in this week's lab. While we're on the topic of vascular tissue, this is a good place to discuss the different types of tissues present in plants, specifically in plant roots, stems, and leaves. So plants have dermal tissue, which include the epidermis of the plant, which is an outer covering that protects the plant and is typically just a single layer of cells. And when we're looking at leaves, the dermal tissue also includes the stomata, which you'll see later are structures that allow for the exchange of water and gases. The vascular tissue refers to the xylem and the phloem. And recall that these are arranged differently in the stems of monocots compared to the stems of dicots. The xylem is the vascular tissue that transports water and minerals from the roots of the plant to the aerial parts of the plant, so to the leaves. And the movement of water, or the transport of water up from the roots to the leaves, involves a series of factors, or requires a series of factors, which we're not going to cover in detail in the lab, but which you'll look at more closely in the lecture. But some of these factors include the evaporation of water from the leaves through the stomata, which helps to basically pull water from the xylem, and that in turn helps to pull water from the roots to the leaves, from the xylem that's located in the roots to the stems and then the leaves. This also involves water potential, which is created by the fact that there are ions that are pumped into cells in the roots of the plant, and the presence of these ions allows for water to move in from the soil by osmosis. The other vascular tissue is the phloem, and unlike the xylem, which moves water and minerals in one direction, upward, the phloem can move sugars in both directions. So this is going to transport sugars and also amino acids from their source, where they're made, to other locations of the plant where they are needed. For example, roots, and sometimes to places like flowers. Finally, the other type of plant tissues are the ground tissues, which include the parenchyma, collenchyma, and sclerenchyma. Parenchyma cells can be found in leaves, but also in other parts of the plant like the stem. And in the stems, these are going to be located in the cortex of the stem, but also the pith, which is surrounded by the vascular tissue. So the red here is the xylem, the green is the phloem, and this inner portion here is the pith, which is composed of parenchyma cells. And these parenchyma cells are the cells that are most metabolically active. So these are cells that store starch, for example. In leaves, parenchyma cells are the site of photosynthesis, and parenchyma cells often retain the ability to divide, so they help to repair wounds in the plant. Collenchyma cells, which are shown here, are cells that help to support young parts of the plant shoot. So these are cells that are alive and they provide support, but they don't restrict growth. Sclerenchyma cells, which are shown here, also provide support to plants, but they are more rigid than the collenchyma cells. And at maturity, these cells will actually die, but they will still remain and help to support the plant. Returning to the differences between monocots and dicots, another difference between these two types of plants is that in monocots, there's only primary growth, which means that these plants can only grow vertically. However, dicots can also grow in width, so they exhibit something that is known as secondary growth. That does not mean that there aren't monocot plants that are woody and quite large, like palm trees, but as you can see, there are no growth rings in a palm tree when it's cut, whereas these can be seen in dicots. So these dicots can continue to grow year after year in width or girth. Monocots and dicots also differ in the structure of the roots. In monocots, the roots are fibrous, as you can see here, whereas dicots have a long taproot that continues to grow, and from this taproot, smaller roots project. The pattern of veins, which is the vascular tissue seen in the leaves of monocots and dicots, is also different. In monocots, these leaves, as you can see here, are parallel to each other, whereas in dicots, these look like a web. Like other parts of the plants, leaves also have vascular bundles, so they have xylem and phloem. In addition to that, leaves have an upper epidermis, which secretes a cuticle, and a lower epidermis, which also secretes a cuticle to help prevent water loss. In addition to having the epidermis, the leaf also has the parenchymal cells, which include a layer of parenchyma that's known as the palisade, and another layer that's known as a spongy parenchyma. And this is where photosynthesis takes place, mostly in the layer of parenchyma that is the palisade, which is the more compact. So this is where you have most of the chloroplast and where photosynthesis is happening. In the lower epidermis, you have the stoma, which is the site of exchange of water and gases. The stomata are small pores that congregate on the underside of the leaf that open to allow gases in and out, and they close to stop the flow of gases. Water can also come in and out of the stomata. Now, the opening and closing of the stomata is controlled by guard cells, which are the cells that surround the pore, which open when they are turgid, as you can see here. So when there's more water in the vacuoles that are present within these guard cells, then these cells become turgid, and that causes the opening of the stomata. Although the stomata have to open in order to allow carbon dioxide to enter so that photosynthesis can take place, when this happens, water can also exit the plant cells. So if it's a very hot day, the plant has to regulate when to open and close the stomata to minimize water loss. The last aspect of angiosperms we're going to discuss is the reproduction of these plants, which involves the flower, which are the defining feature of the angiosperms, the presence of flowers. Now, in the flower, you have the parts of the plant that house the gametophytes, so either the sperm and the pollen or the eggs or oocytes. The male reproductive organ of the flower is the stamen, and you could see that it has a filament, which is basically a stalk, and an anther. And the anther is what holds the pollen, which are the male gametophytes. So within the pollen, you have the sperm. The female reproductive organ is the carpel, which you can see here. And this is composed of a stigma, which is a sticky surface to which the sperm or the pollen grains rather stick. Then there's a style in some carpels, which is a stalk. And finally, you have the ovary, which houses the eggs or the female gametophytes. The petals, which are often very colorful, serve to attract pollinators like bees. And flowers also produce nectar, and this is also something that attracts these pollinators. Now, the pollinators, like the bees, are going to catch a pollen when they come into contact with the flower, and then they can transport that pollen to other flowers. Pollination happens when pollen is deposited on the sticky surface of the stigma. If the sperm is compatible, a pollen tube forms and two sperm nuclei travel through this pollen tube. In angiosperms, you have a type of fertilization that is known as double fertilization, and I'm going to explain why that's the case in a moment. You see that there are two sperm nuclei. Each of these nuclei is haploid. The egg nucleus that is located within the ovary is also haploid, and you also have polar nuclei, which are also haploid. Now, one of the sperm nuclei is going to fuse with the egg nucleus to give rise to the zygote, which is diploid. The other sperm nucleus is going to fuse with the two polar nuclei to give rise to a triploid structure that is known as the endosperm nucleus. The zygote will give rise to the embryo, which is going to form the plant structure, whereas the endosperm nucleus will basically serve to feed the developing embryo. The presence of male and female reproductive parts in flowers can vary. You can have flowers that are hermaphrodites, which have both male and female reproductive parts within the same flower. You can also have plants that are known as monoecious plants, which means that the plant has both male and female reproductive parts, but they are located on different flowers. So you can have male flowers and female flowers. There are also dioecious plants, which have either only male flowers or only female flowers. So the same species, you would have some plants that have the male flower and some plants that have the female flowers. Now, angiosperms typically do not self-pollinate even when they have hermaphrodite flowers. And this is because there are biochemical blocks that give plants the ability to reject its own pollen. The fact that angiosperms typically do not self-pollinate is important because this helps to increase diversity. Nevertheless, angiosperms are also capable of asexual reproduction, and this is because there are portions of the plant that are known as meristems that contain undifferentiated dividing cells. So if you were to transplant the meristem to a new location, that could give rise to an entirely new plant. In summary, angiosperms are seed-bearing vascular plants which have the sporophyte as the dominant stage. And just like in the gymnosperm, the gametophyte is microscopic. The main difference between the gymnosperm and the angiosperms is the fact that the angiosperms have flowers and that the seeds of the angiosperm are protected because they're enclosed in fruits.